The rotors were still spinning when she laughed. It wasn't a quiet laugh, not the kind a person swallows when something catches them off guard. It was open, deliberate, and loud enough to carry across the tarmac to the small group of associates trailing behind her with rolling luggage and pressed expressions. The afternoon heat radiated off the concrete in slow, visible waves, and the sky above the private airfield was the wide, indifferent blue of early summer, too bright and too vast to care about whatever was happening beneath it. There was a smell of fuel and hot metal and, faintly, the dry scrubland that bordered three sides of the property, and it was into this particular sensory landscape that Victoria Langley's laughter landed clear, uncontained, and carrying with it the full weight of a woman who had spent 2 decades learning how to occupy a room and had simply extended that capacity to the outdoors. She had seen something amusing. She had decided immediately that it was safe to be amused by it. That was all it took. Across the tarmac, perhaps 40 meters from where her sleek chartered helicopter was cooling down on its pad, an older man in work clothes was crouching beside a machine that did not, by any visible measure, belong in the company of the aircraft around it. He was running a cloth along the lower housing of an engine compartment with slow, methodical attention, the kind that belongs to a person who is not performing care but practicing it, and he did not look up at the sound of her arrival. The helicopter beside him was old and olive drab, and wore its age without apology. It had no reason to impress anyone. Neither, apparently, did the man tending to it. Victoria Langley looked at both of them for less than 5 seconds and decided, with the swift certainty that had served her so well in boardrooms and acquisition meetings, that she understood exactly what she was looking at. She was wrong. She would spend the rest of the afternoon finding out how wrong, and she would spend considerably longer than that thinking about what it meant. Victoria Langley stepped off the last rung of her helicopter's boarding ladder and planted both heels on the private airfield's sun-warmed concrete as though she were claiming territory. Her sunglasses were designer. Her blazer was tailored. Her entire posture broadcast the kind of confidence that doesn't grow naturally but gets manufactured over years of deals closed and rooms commanded. She was 41 years old, the founder and chief executive of Langley Meridian Holdings, a mid-sized private equity firm that had spent the last 5 years quietly gobbling up undervalued commercial real estate across the Southwest. She had been profiled twice in national business publications. She had a waiting list for her keynote appearances. She believed, with a certainty that felt almost spiritual, that the world arranged itself into 2 categories of people: those who made things happen and those who watched from a distance and wondered how. She had decided long ago which category she belonged to. The airfield itself was not famous. Thornridge Private Aviation, a slim corridor of runway, 3 hangars, a modest terminal building faced in pale stone, and a fuel depot at the northern end, sat about 22 miles east of the city, surrounded on 3 sides by flat scrubland that shimmered in the afternoon heat. It served a specific clientele: corporate flights, charter operators, the occasional wealthy hobbyist who preferred to avoid the controlled chaos of the commercial airports. The staff was small, efficient, and trained to remain invisible unless needed. The kind of place where discretion was the unspoken house rule. Victoria was here to finalize the groundwork for what her team had taken to calling, internally, the Cornerstone deal: a logistics conglomerate, 2 real estate development partners, and a regional infrastructure fund were converging on an agreement that would reshape the freight and light cargo aviation corridor in the region. Part of the puzzle involved land rights adjacent to Thornridge. She needed the airfield, or at least a long-term usage arrangement that would give her firm the access it required to make the larger development viable. She had sent 2 analysts ahead of her 3 days earlier. She had been told the preliminary conversations were going well. She had booked the VIP meeting suite in the terminal for 3 o'clock. She was, in her own estimation, approximately 4 hours from sealing the most important deal of her career. And then, she saw the helicopter. It sat in the open air between 2 of the hangars, maybe 40 meters from where her own sleek machine was still cooling down. It was old, not vintage in the curated, lovingly restored way that old aircraft sometimes are, but genuinely, honestly aged. The paint was a faded olive green that had long since stopped trying to look uniform. The fuselage carried the small dents and discolorations of real use, real weather, real decades. One of the landing skids bore a patch that had been welded and repainted at some point, the seam still visible. The whole thing looked as though it had spent a significant portion of its life doing work that did not care about appearances. Crouched beside it, running a cloth along the lower edge of the engine compartment with methodical attention, was a man. He was somewhere in his mid-40s. He wore a pair of worn work pants and a plain gray t-shirt with a small grease mark near the hem. His hands were large and capable-looking. He had the build of someone who had been athletic in his younger years and had maintained it not through a gym but through the kind of physical engagement that comes from actually doing things. His hair was dark, slightly longer than neat, and he wore it without apparent concern for how it looked in the afternoon wind. He did not notice her at first. Or, if he did, he gave no indication that it seemed important. Victoria stopped walking and looked at him. Then she looked at the helicopter. Then she turned to her nearest associate, a sharp young woman named Priya, who handled logistics and never seemed to stop taking notes, and said, with the casual cruelty of someone who doesn't think of it as cruelty, "Tell me that's not his actual aircraft." Priya glanced over, offered a small, uncertain smile, and said nothing. "Because if that thing can still fly," Victoria continued, loud enough now that two of the airfield staff nearby could hear clearly, "I have genuine questions about the inspection standards at this facility." She said it with a bright edge that made it sound like a joke, the kind of joke that means exactly what it says. Her entourage moved toward the terminal. But Victoria slowed her pace, watching the man for another moment. He had stood from his crouch and was now running the cloth along the lower rotor hub with the same quiet concentration he'd been applying before her arrival. She studied him the way she had learned to study people. Quickly, categorically, with the goal of placing them somewhere useful on a mental map. Work clothes, aging equipment, a posture that suggested no awareness of its own insignificance. She had seen this type before, men who had once been skilled at something, who still showed up out of habit or stubbornness, who confused long tenure for relevance. "He must be one of the maintenance contractors," she said to no one in particular, "the ones they call in when the regular crew is stretched." She adjusted her sunglasses and turned toward the terminal. "Let's hope he's better at fixing things than he is at choosing transportation." Priya didn't respond. Marcus, Victoria's senior associate, glanced back once at the man beside the old helicopter, then followed without comment. The man with the cloth heard her. He had heard all of it. He stood still for a moment, looking out across the tarmac in the direction of the terminal. And then he did something that struck the two airfield staff members who witnessed the exchange as oddly composed. He smiled, very slightly, to himself, and went back to his work. His name was Daniel Marsh. He had a daughter named Sophie, who was 9 years old, and who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be a marine biologist. He coached her soccer team on Saturday mornings. He made pancakes on Sunday. He drove a truck that was 3 years old and perfectly functional, and he saw no reason to replace it. He owned the airfield that Victoria Langley had just landed on, had owned it for 11 years, and had been the quiet majority stakeholder in the holding company that managed its operations since before many of her current associates had graduated college. He was, by any reasonable financial measure, considerably wealthier than she was. He did not mention this to people at parties. The terminal's interior was cool and understated. Pale floors, wide windows facing the runway, a small lounge area with leather seating that managed to suggest quality without announcing it. Victoria moved through it, with the ease of someone who had never not been comfortable in expensive rooms. She requested the VIP suite immediately, was told it would be ready within 15 minutes, and spent that time reviewing her deal documents on a tablet, while her team arranged themselves around a low table and conducted the low-grade preparatory murmur that preceded important meetings. She did not think about the man outside. She had placed him in a category and moved on. But the airfield staff did not treat him like someone who should be in a category and moved on from. This became apparent to Priya first, not because she was looking for it, but because it was difficult to miss once you noticed it. A fuel technician crossed the tarmac and nodded to Daniel Marsh in a way that was different from the polite nod one gives a colleague. It was the nod one gives someone whose opinion actually matters. A woman in a Thornridge polo who appeared to manage some part of the ground operations stopped beside him for what looked like a substantive conversation. She had a clipboard. She showed him something on it. He pointed at one section. said something, and she nodded and made a note. Two younger mechanics who emerged from the nearest hangar both acknowledged him before they acknowledged each other. Priya watched this from the terminal window for a moment, then put it in the back of her mind. Old-timer. Probably. Someone who'd been around long enough to accumulate that particular species of informal authority. It happened at small operations like this. A veteran mechanic, a long-time line supervisor, someone who'd been hired before the current management structure existed and had simply stayed, accruing a kind of institutional gravity that was easier to work around than to displace. She made a note to check on the status of the usage agreement documentation and turned back to her laptop. But the pattern continued in ways that were harder to explain away. When a fuel truck experienced a minor hydraulic issue near the western apron, the dispatcher's first call was not to the maintenance supervisor's office. It was to Daniel. He was on the tarmac within 4 minutes, knelt beside the vehicle for a short time, and then stood and spoke briefly to the arriving mechanic, who listened and nodded and addressed the problem using exactly the approach Daniel had suggested. When a charter flight arrived with a scheduling discrepancy, the sort of minor operational friction that usually took 30 minutes to untangle across 3 departments, it took 7 minutes once Daniel was involved in the conversation, not because he commanded anyone, but because he knew precisely which variable was causing the confusion and how to remove it. Priya was paying closer attention by then. She had moved her seat to a window-facing angle that gave her a clearer view of the tarmac and the hangar aprons, and she watched with the same analytical instinct she brought to deal modeling. Something about the information didn't resolve into the category she had assigned it. The informal authority of a long-tenured employee looked a particular way. It involved a certain deference that was warm but horizontal, the kind shared between colleagues who had earned one another's regard over time. What she was watching was different. It was vertical, without being performed the respect one gives not to someone who has been around for a long time, but to someone who is ultimately responsible. She opened a new tab on her laptop and typed the name of Thornridge Private Aviation's operating entity into a search field. Inside Hangar 2, meanwhile, Daniel was looking at the engine maintenance log for a Cessna Citation that was scheduled to depart the following morning. The chief mechanic, a meticulous man named Gerald, who had worked at Thornridge for 9 years, had flagged a compressor reading that he wanted a second opinion on. Gerald was exceptional at his job and he knew it. And he was not the kind of person who sought validation. He still asked Daniel, not because he was required to, but because Daniel had forgotten more about rotorcraft and fixed-wing mechanics than most people would ever learn, and because Gerald respected that in the particular way that real craftsmen respect other real craftsmen. Cleanly, completely, without the need to make it about anything else, Daniel reviewed the log, asked 2 questions, pointed at a specific maintenance notation from the previous service cycle, and said, in a measured and entirely calm tone, that they should run the full diagnostic before the morning flight, regardless of what the quick check showed. There was a particular sequence of compressor behaviors that, in this engine model, could produce a false positive on the abbreviated check. And if the previous service notation meant what he thought it meant, the abbreviated check would miss it. Gerald agreed without hesitation. Neither of them felt the need to explain who had the authority to make that call. It was simply understood, because it had always simply been understood, in the way that things are when the ground beneath them is solid. The meeting suite had tall windows and a long table that seated 12. Victoria arrived at 2:30, slightly ahead of the others, and was reviewing the room's audio-visual setup with characteristic impatience when the door opened and the Airfield's operations manager, a composed and careful man named Harrison Webb, stepped inside. He was followed, to Victoria's mild surprise, by Daniel Marsh. Daniel had changed his t-shirt. He now wore a simple collared shirt, untucked, with the same work pants as before. He still looked entirely informal compared to everyone else in the room. He nodded to Harrison, acknowledged Victoria with a brief, neutral glance, and moved to the far side of the table to look at something in the documents spread there. Victoria felt the irritation arrive before she fully understood its source. "I'm sorry," she said, with a precision that was sharper than the words themselves. "Is this meeting open to all staff?" Or, Harrison began to speak, but Daniel turned from the documents first. "I apologize for the overlap," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the way some people's voices are when they have learned, over time, not to let urgency make a mess of language. I'll be out of your way in a moment. I just wanted to check the runway access schedule for Thursday. There's a conflict with one of our regular charter operators that affects your team's arrival window. Victoria's eyebrows rose. Our arrival window. Your Friday departure, he clarified simply. You've requested runway 1 for 7:30. We have a standing commercial operator on runway 1 at 7, and they run long. I wanted to flag it so your team could confirm whether 7:30 is firm or if there's flexibility. Victoria stared at him. Something about the exchange did not fit the category she had put him in. She recalibrated, placed him in a slightly different one. A senior operations coordinator, perhaps. Someone who had worked his way into a position of mild administrative authority. She softened her tone by a fraction enough to be functional, not enough to be warm. I appreciate that, she said, but I don't think this is the moment for logistics. We have a significant business meeting beginning shortly. Of course, Daniel said. He picked up the document he had been reviewing, which turned out to be a single page, folded it once, and placed it in his shirt pocket. One other thing, he added, with the same measured tone. The usage agreement your team submitted, there are 2 clauses related to infrastructure modification rights that I'd want to revisit before anything gets signed. Not a block, just a flag. There's some language about foundation access near the north boundary that's broader than what we've historically granted. Victoria opened her mouth and then closed it. The reference to the usage agreement, the specific language, the specific boundary reference, was not the observation of someone reading from a clipboard. It was the observation of someone who knew what they were looking at. She turned to Marcus, who gave her a look that she couldn't quite read. We'll take that under advisement, she said, in the voice she used when she wanted to end conversations. Daniel nodded. He looked, briefly, at the full room. Then he said, in a tone that was quiet enough that only the people nearest him caught it clearly. The north boundary runs through the lode, bearing corridor for any significant vertical construction. If that clause stays as written, you'll need a geological survey before any contractor will touch it. Just something to know before you sign. He nodded again, to no one in particular, and walked out. The room was very quiet for a moment. Harrison Webb's expression had shifted into something that was carefully, professionally neutral. 2 of the engineers who had been waiting near the window exchanged a glance that was not neutral at all. Victoria looked at Marcus. Who? She said slowly. Is that man? Nobody answered her directly. This was not evasion. Exactly, it was more that the people in the room had individual reasons to hesitate, and those reasons all pointed in the same direction, without anyone needing to coordinate. Harrison said he would get someone to clarify the runway schedule, and left. The engineers became absorbed in their documents. Priya, who had been watching the interaction from the doorway, stepped fully into the room with an expression she was working hard to keep from becoming a frown. Victoria noticed a folder on the end of the table bearing the name of the holding company that managed Thornridge's operational assets. She had reviewed this documentation during the preliminary phase. The holding company was called Marsh Creek Aviation Partners. She had seen the name dozens of times in the past week, and had processed it the way one processes legal boilerplate as background, as scaffolding. Not as information with a face attached to it. She pulled the folder toward her and opened it. The signatory on the primary operating documents was listed, as it had been every time she had seen it, as Daniel A. Marsh, Managing Principal. She had read that name. She had not connected it to a man in a gray t-shirt crouching beside an old helicopter with a cloth in his hands. She connected it now. She found the ownership summary page in the folder. She had read it before, but she read it differently now, with the specific, urgent attention of someone trying to locate a mistake. There was no mistake. The airfield property itself, the operational holding, the mineral rights on the adjacent land, and the long-term ground lease on the North Expansion Corridor were all held through a family trust, Marsh Family Holdings, with Daniel A. Marsh listed as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. Victoria sat down. Not dramatically, she didn't perform things for empty rooms, but genuinely. Because standing suddenly felt like an unnecessary expenditure of energy. She read the ownership summary a second time, then a third. The structure was clean, Not hidden, there was nothing complicated about it when you actually looked. Marsh Family Holdings owned the land. Marsh Creek Aviation Partners held the operational licenses. Daniel A. Marsh was the named principal across every entity in the chain. The documentation had been in her team's possession for a week. Every one of her analysts had read through it. She had read through it herself, on a Tuesday evening, sitting in her office with a glass of water and the quiet confidence of someone who believed she already knew the shape of a deal before she finished reading the details. She had processed the name the way she processed names in legal documents, as textual furniture, as the scaffolding that the actual business logic was mounted upon. Daniel A. Marsh had existed, on every page of the preliminary file, as a function, a signatory, a legal instrument. She had not once, in 7 days of preparation, connected those letters on a page to the possibility of a person she might encounter, a person who might be, at the moment of her arrival, crouched beside an old machine with a cloth in his hands. Entirely outside the visual vocabulary she associated with ownership and authority, her deal required Thornridge. Specifically, it required the north boundary access that Daniel had mentioned in the meeting room, the same boundary where his flagged clause lived, the same corridor that would need to be clear of conflicting agreements for her development partners to proceed. Without that access, the logistics infrastructure plan that anchored the entire cornerstone deal lost its coherence. The deal didn't collapse, exactly, but it lost its legs. It became something that could be renegotiated, restructured, pursued through alternative channels over a longer timeline, which is to say, it became something else entirely, something smaller, something that the partners who had committed their confidence and capital to the current structure would view as a failure of execution. Victoria had never failed on execution. She had built her entire reputation on the specific conviction that when she said a deal was ready to close, the deal was ready to close. She sat with that understanding for a full minute, and the minute had a quality to it that was uncommon in her experience. It was the minute of recognizing that you have made a problem that did not exist before you arrived. The opportunity had been entirely real. The agreement had been entirely achievable. She had walked into a situation that asked nothing of her except competence and reasonable human regard, and she had introduced into it a variable that served no purpose and created real risk. She had done it for no reason except the habit of deciding quickly what things were worth. She stood, straightened her blazer, and asked Priya, who appeared in the doorway at precisely that moment, with an expression that Victoria now understood was not uncertainty, but the controlled, diplomatic blankness of someone who had just finished reading something on a laptop and was deciding what to do with the information to find out where Daniel Marsh was. He was in the smaller of the two pilot lounges, on the western side of the terminal, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug and reading something on his phone with the unhurried manner of a man who has nowhere he needs to be. This was not accurate. He had several places he needed to be that afternoon, including a pickup at Sophie's school at 4:30, that he had been managing his schedule around all day, but he did not project urgency. He had learned, a long time ago, that urgency is rarely the thing that solves a problem. Victoria entered the lounge with a posture that was still, by any objective standard, commanding. She was not a small woman in spirit or in carriage, but something in the room shifted when she entered it and found Daniel already sitting in it, settled and at ease, in a way that she noticed and could not entirely explain. She sat across from him without being invited to do so, a habit, not a statement, and said, "I owe you an apology." Daniel set his phone face down on the table. He looked at her with the same, even appraising calm he had used on the tarmac, in the meeting room, everywhere she had encountered him. It was not coldness. It wasn't performance. It was simply the way of a man who had long since stopped organizing himself around other people's expectations. "I made assumptions about you," she said, more directly, "when I arrived. Based on..." She paused. The word she was looking for was not precisely available. "Based on what I saw. And I said things that were dismissive and unkind." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you actually see?" It was a real question. Not rhetorical. Not pointed in the way designed to make her feel small. He seemed to actually want to know. She found it disarming in a way that boardroom confrontations rarely were. "An older helicopter," she said. Work clothes. Someone who didn't look like. She stopped again. Didn't look like someone who belonged here, he finished, without heat. She didn't deny it. You know what I actually saw when you landed, Daniel said. He leaned back slightly in his chair. I saw someone who arrived somewhere new and spent the first 30 seconds deciding what everything was worth, including people. He paused, not to let the observation sting, but to give it space to be heard. I've had that done to me more times than I can count. It doesn't get more pleasant with repetition, but I also know that the people who do it aren't always aware they're doing it. They've just been operating in environments where that's how you navigate. Victoria said nothing. The quality of her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of someone managing a room, but of someone actually listening. That helicopter, Daniel said, is the first aircraft I ever purchased. 19 years ago. I was 26. I had just left a regional airline where I'd been flying for 3 years, and I'd saved every cent I could, and I found that particular machine in an auction lot in eastern Texas for a price that told me it had been through several rounds of hard use. He stopped for a moment, and something in his expression shifted not to sentiment, but to the quiet satisfaction of a man retelling a history he is proud of. I fixed it myself over the course of a winter. I learned things about rotorcraft mechanics that you don't learn in any classroom. Then I used it to start a charter service. The charter service financed the first property acquisition. The property acquisition financed the second. Eventually, this place. He gestured, unhurriedly, at the room around them and by extension, at everything around the room. I keep that helicopter because it reminds me of the version of myself that had nothing except a clear idea of what he was building. Victoria looked at the table for a moment. It wasn't on the literature, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. No, he agreed, without triumph. It wasn't. Your name was on every document, she said. I just didn't connect it to a face, he said. Connect it to that face, she said, honestly. He looked at her for a long moment. I have a daughter, he said. She's 9. I don't advertise what I have, because I don't want her growing up in an environment where worth is defined by what things look like. I want her to understand that the things you carry quietly are the things that actually matter. He picked up his coffee. That's a personal choice. I know the world doesn't always agree with it. The 3 o'clock meeting began 40 minutes late, which, in the context of negotiations of this scale, was not unusual. What was slightly unusual was the atmosphere inside the suite. Harrison Webb had arranged the room so that Daniel sat at the natural head of the table, not conspicuously, but simply in the seat where the person with the most relevant authority typically sits. The logistics partners and development representatives who had arrived separately took their places with the particular attentiveness of people who knew exactly who they were in the room with. Victoria sat to Daniel's left. She had chosen the seat deliberately. She was not, she decided, going to spend this meeting performing a recovery from the tarmac. She was going to do her job. She did her job well. It was, genuinely, the one thing she had never required external validation, for she could read a deal, understand the pressure points, identify the leverage and the risk, and navigate toward an outcome without the social scaffolding that tripped up less capable negotiators. The infrastructure clause that Daniel had flagged was real, and her team resolved it in under 40 minutes, with language that protected both parties. The runway access schedule was reorganized around a secondary priority system that her departure team could work with. The North Boundary Corridor issue, the one that had made her sit down alone in the meeting room 2 hours earlier, was addressed through a structured access agreement that gave her development partners what they needed while preserving Daniel's operational controls. At one point, midway through the session, one of the logistics representatives began to steer the discussion toward a term that Victoria recognized as disadvantageous. But that was being presented with enough technical complexity to obscure the issue. She started to respond, but Daniel had already begun speaking. He addressed the term precisely, without drama, dismantled the obfuscation, and redirected the conversation to a cleaner framework in a way that left no ambiguity about what he understood and what he would and would not accept. Victoria caught herself noting, with something between admiration and chagrin, that he was better at this than she had expected. She revised the thought immediately. He was better at this than most people she had ever sat across a table from. When the session ended, just after 5, and the parties had shaken hands and the room had begun to empty, Marcus caught Victoria's eye from across the table with an expression that said, plainly, that he had learned something that afternoon. She had too. The tarmac was cooling toward evening. The light had shifted from its aggressive afternoon white to the softer, horizontal gold that long days sometimes produce in flat, open country. Victoria walked out toward the helicopter pads after the formal session concluded, carrying her jacket over one arm, and found herself, without quite having planned it, walking in the direction of Hangar 2. The old olive-green helicopter was back inside, under the diffuse light of the hangar's overhead fixtures. Daniel was there as well, not crouched this time, but standing at the workbench near the wall, reviewing a maintenance log. He didn't look up immediately when she entered, but he was aware of her. She could tell by the slight adjustment in his posture that signaled the shift from solitude to company. "I wanted to say it again," she said, without a business outcome attached to it. He looked up, waited. "Earlier, I apologized because I'd just realized you owned the airfield. I want to be honest, I can't fully separate that from what I said, because I'm not sure I would have apologized if I hadn't found out. And that's not something I'm proud of." She held his gaze. "But I've been thinking about what you said. About arriving somewhere and deciding what everything is worth. I've been doing that my whole career, and I've told myself it was just efficiency, screening, pattern recognition." She paused. "I think I've just been deciding." Daniel set down the maintenance log. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was often quiet, not absent, but genuinely present to the space between words. "The thing about patterns," he said, "is that they're real. You're right that the world is full of signals, and reading them quickly is a skill. I'm not going to tell you that surface cues are meaningless." He moved slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the old helicopter's airframe. "But there's a difference between reading a situation and closing it. Between observing and concluding. The first is intelligence. The second is where most people get into trouble." "I closed it fast," she said. "You closed it fast," he agreed. She looked at the helicopter. In the hangar light, the age of it was more visible. And so, strangely, was the care that had been put into it, the welds that were done properly, the clean engine compartment, the evidence of ongoing maintenance on a machine that had no reason to be maintained unless someone cared about it. "You said you fixed this yourself. One winter," he said. "Why keep it out on the tarmac?" He considered the question. "Because I want to remember what it felt like to not know if it was going to work." He said it simply, without performance. Success has a way of making you forget the uncertainty. Once you forget the uncertainty, you stop being careful. And when you stop being careful, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Victoria stood with that for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "My first deal was a building in the warehouse district that everybody told me was too distressed to be worth looking at. I drove out there on a Tuesday afternoon, after 3 people had told me no, and I stood in the parking lot, and I looked at it and I thought, no one is looking at this the right way. And I was right. I still have it." She paused. "I should probably think about that building more often." "Probably," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not unkind, not warm in an excessive way, but simply honest, that felt like the most genuine thing anyone had said to her in a long while. Priya found her 10 minutes later, standing just inside the hangar entrance while the light outside continued its slow shift toward dusk. Victoria turned when she heard footsteps and arranged her expression into something like its normal configuration, which was not difficult. She had been doing that her whole professional life. But she felt, underneath the arrangement, something that she did not immediately have a name for. Not humility. Exactly, she was too much herself for the word to sit comfortably. Not shame, which would have been unproductive. It was closer to the sensation of a recalibration. The quiet mechanical shift that happens when something you've been relying on is proven to be slightly out of alignment, and you understand that the adjustments required are not large, but they are real, and they need to be made carefully, and over time, and not merely declared and forgotten. She had declared enough things in her life. She understood the difference. "Car is ready when you are," Priya said. 2 minutes, Victoria said. She walked back through the hangar toward the main doors and paused once more beside the old helicopter. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she touched, briefly, one hand to its weathered fuselage, not reverently, but matter-of-factly, the way you touch something old when you want to acknowledge that it has a history. She walked out without looking back. Daniel Marsh left Thornridge at 6:12 that evening. He drove north, as he did most evenings, along a route that took him past the eastern edge of the scrubland and into the quieter suburban grid where he and Sophie had lived for the past 6 years. The truck was comfortable and familiar. The radio played a station he barely listened to. The day had been long and had contained more than the usual density of things to manage, and he was ready for it to be done. He picked Sophie up from his neighbor's house at 6:45. She had grass stains on both knees and had been, by her own enthusiastic report, the highest scorer in the afternoon's informal game. She talked for most of the drive home, covering the soccer game, a book she was reading about deep-sea creatures, a theory she had developed about why the neighbor's cat looked so perpetually judgmental, and a question about whether it was possible to build an underwater research station in the back of the neighbor's swimming pool. Daniel answered as he drove, not distractedly, but fully, the way he engaged with everything she said, because she was 9, and because everything she said mattered, and because he had understood, almost from the day she was born, that the quality of a person's attention is one of the things they give to the world, whether they mean to or not. They had dinner at the kitchen table. Sophie wanted to know what the airfield had been like that day, whether any interesting aircraft had come in, and he told her about the logistics company's twin engine, which she found legitimately impressive, and about the fuel truck situation, and how Gerald had figured out the compressor problem before noon. He did not mention Victoria Langley, or her arrival, or the hours between. There were things from work that were interesting to a 9-year-old, and things that were not. And Daniel was good at knowing the difference. He had always believed that children deserved to be spoken to about the actual world, not a simplified version of it, but that the actual world was large enough to contain many things worth sharing before it became necessary to introduce the parts that were mainly useful for adults. After dinner, he helped her review her science homework, which concerned the nitrogen cycle, and which she found irritating because, as she explained with great feeling, it seemed like something that should be simpler than it was. He agreed that it should be simpler. They worked through it anyway, and somewhere in the middle of it she stopped being irritated and became genuinely curious about why bacteria were involved at all, which led to a 20-minute conversation about microorganisms that wandered considerably further than the homework required, and was, by any measure, more interesting than the homework itself. He did not redirect her back to the assignment until she had followed the curiosity as far as it wanted to go. He had learned, in the years of raising her alone, that the curiosity was the point, and the assignment was just the occasion for it. Later, after Sophie was in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Daniel sat for a while in the kitchen with a second cup of coffee and the particular stillness that follows a day that has held more weight than usual. He thought, briefly, about Victoria Langley, not with bitterness, and not with the satisfaction that some people might have felt in the same position. He thought about her the way he thought about most things, as a piece of information. She was someone who had confused fluency in a certain kind of language, the language of visible success, of projected authority, of curated impression, with a total understanding of a world that was considerably larger and more varied than that language could describe. She would adjust, or she wouldn't. He had no investment in which way it went. He thought about the first time someone had done to him what she had done. He had been 23, sitting in the lobby of a bank in Dallas in work clothes because he had come straight from a job, asking about a small business loan for the charter service he wanted to start. The loan officer had looked at him for approximately 4 seconds and then spent the next 15 minutes explaining, with the patient condescension of someone who believes they are doing a kindness, why the business model was probably not viable for someone in his position. Daniel had listened, thanked the man, driven to a different bank, and gotten the loan. He did not think about the loan officer often. He thought about him now, briefly, and recognized in the memory the specific texture that connected it to today, the particular variety of wrong that happens when a person mistakes the surface of a thing for its depth, when they see the cover and decide they already know the story. What he had an investment in was the thing he always had an investment in. The work itself, done well, done honestly, without theater. He rinsed the mug, turned out the lights, checked the door, and went to bed. In the weeks that followed, The cornerstone deal moved through its remaining stages with the competence that Victoria's team had always been capable of. The North Boundary Access Agreement was formalized cleanly. The runway schedule was updated. The documentation that passed between Langley Meridian and Marsh Creek Aviation Partners was handled by legal and operations staff on both sides, who understood what they were handling without requiring instruction from above. Victoria held 2 internal meetings in that period that her associates found slightly unusual. Not in content, the decisions made were sensible, thoroughly argued, well-reasoned, but in texture. She spent more time on the early stages of assessment. She asked, on at least 3 occasions, whether her team was looking at a situation from a sufficient number of angles before arriving at conclusions. She flagged, once, a judgment call that one of her managers had made about a small property owner, and she did it without performance, just as a correction. We don't know enough about this person's position yet. Get more information before we decide what they're worth to the deal. Priya noted it. Marcus noted it. Neither of them said anything about it, because it didn't require commentary. It was simply a shift. Small, real, and moving in the right direction. On a Saturday morning in October, about 7 weeks after the meeting at Thornridge, Daniel Marsh arrived at the airfield at 7:15, as he usually did on mornings when he had no other commitments until mid-afternoon. He made coffee in the pilot lounge, reviewed the week's operational logs, spoke briefly with Harrison about a maintenance procurement question, and then, as he often did when the morning was clear and the light was good, walked out to Hangar 2. The helicopter sat exactly where it always did. The light came through the high windows at an angle that made the old paint look, for a moment, like something other than what it was. Not glamorous, but honest, and in its own way, beautiful. He retrieved the cloth from its hook on the wall and began the slow, habitual work of checking and cleaning, moving from the tail rotor assembly forward, his hands knowing exactly where to go and what to feel for. It was a ritual, and he knew it was a ritual, and he did not require anyone else to understand what it meant. The helicopter had carried him forward from a point where nothing was certain and everything was possible. And it still carried him forward in the only way such things can, not through the air, but through memory, through the specific reminder that capability is built, not assumed, and that the version of you that believed before the evidence arrived deserves to be honored. He worked without urgency, and the morning was quiet, and the day was his. There is a particular kind of error that intelligent people are especially prone to making. It is not the error of ignorance. That kind is at least self-aware. It is the error of pattern, the mistake of believing that the things you have learned to recognize are the same as the things that exist. The world is very large and very varied, and the indicators of depth, of substance, of genuine accomplishment are not consistent across it. Some people carry their history in their clothing, in their equipment, in the practice language of visible success. Others carry it in their hands, in the decisions they have made quietly over years, in the machines they have fixed, and the properties they have built, and the values they have chosen to transmit to their children in the kitchen after dinner. The error is understandable. It is even, in certain environments, functional, but it is still an error, and the cost of it is real, not always in the dramatic, public way that makes for instructive stories, but more often in the quieter erosion of the understanding that people contain more than any surface can hold. Victoria Langley had been good at her work her entire adult life. She had understood markets, read rooms, made decisions that most people would not have had the courage or the clarity to make. None of that was false. None of it disappeared in the light of a single afternoon's reckoning. But she had allowed the facility of those skills to become, over time, a shorthand for something broader and less precise. A belief that she could assess a person the way she assessed a property, by external condition and visible signals alone, and arrive at a reliable valuation. It was a belief she had never articulated aloud, because articulating it would have required her to hear it, and hearing it would have required her to question it, and questioning it would have interrupted the rhythm of a way of moving through the world that had, by most measures, worked. A man with a cloth and an old helicopter had shown her, without argument or confrontation, that this belief had a floor to it, a level below which it was simply inaccurate. He had done it without trying to, without wanting anything from the lesson, without asking for her acknowledgement. He had simply continued to be what he was, quietly and completely, in full view of her assumptions, and let the distance between those assumptions and reality speak for itself. The most powerful people in any room are rarely the loudest ones in it. The most valuable things in any life are rarely the most visible ones either. The world has a way of organizing itself around this truth, with a patience that outlasts every version of arrogance that has ever tested it. Daniel Marsh knew this. He had known it since a cold winter in a rented hangar in East Texas, with a wrecked helicopter, a set of borrowed tools, a daughter not yet born who would one day want to know everything about deep-sea creatures, and a complete and quiet certainty that he was going to build something worth building. Even though nothing around him yet confirmed that this was true. He had not required confirmation. He had required only the work, and the patience to let the work be its own argument, and the discipline to keep showing up every morning without needing the world to acknowledge why. He had been right. He still was.